Ryan sat on the phone while cutting vegetables, while phone was between her ear and shoulder. She was so into talking to her mother that she didn't even notice that her hand was about to cut when Jungkook came and snatched the knife. His voice a bit louder, making her flinch. Her mother asked in worry, saying that she hung up the call. He said sternly, Ryan apologized with her head lowered. His voice sounded a bit rough. Ryan felt guilty. She apologized while tears welled up in her eyes. He said disappointedly, making Ryan pout. She whimpered, making Jungkook sigh deeply. He ordered, pointed at the living room. Ryan nodded her head and walked out of the kitchen. Ryan wiped her tears away and pouted. She thought while sitting on the bed. She mumbled and put her headphones on. She turned on her music and fell asleep while thinking about her husband. Jungkook finished cooking lunch and went upstairs where YN was sleeping. He thought and checked if she was still sleeping peacefully. He called out her softly. She stirred a little bit. She rubbed her eyes and yawned loudly. He said while smiling at her. She looked away and hummed in the answer before getting up the bed, totally ignoring his existence. He wondered and shook his head. He followed her to the dining table and prepared two plates for them. Jungkook asked and waited for her answer patiently. Wine looked at him and then the dishes. She got up and prepared her own plate without giving him an answer or glance. Jungkook sat and shrugged it off as he wasn't sure what was she up to. He sat across her but made no move to eat the food that was on his plate. He finally asked and reached for her hand to give it some comfort. She glanced at their connected hands and then stared back at her plate. She muttered and continued eating. Jungkook asked and grabbed her other hand. Ryan sighed and looked at her plate again. Jungkook nodded his head and left her hands. They ate the meal silently until it was finished. Ryan then started playing on her phone sitting on the couch while Jungkook cleaned the dishes and dried the last dish. He was annoyed and sulked. He didn't like ignorance. It was frustrating for both of them. She whined while walking towards her bedroom. She knew she should talk things out with Jungkook, but she couldn't figure it out what she was supposed to say to him. So she decided not to make it easier for him. She smirked and went to her closet before taking her dress out. Soon Ryan climbed downstairs. She was ready to go out when Jungkook pulled her to him. He demanded by holding her tight against him. She said simply. He narrowed his eyes at her. He replied. She argued. He shook his head. He said in a serious tone why and sighed and looked away. She mumbled under her breath. He asked, raising an eyebrow curiously. She rolled her eyes and pouted. She replied angrily. He growled and leaned forward, placing his lips directly next to her ear. He whispered menacingly and squished her hips lightly with both of his strong hands. Vian gulped nervously. A shiver went down her spine every time he touched her like that. He teased and smirked at her. He raised one of her hands to his lips and planted tiny kisses along her fingers and wrist gently. She sat with red face trying to hide herself. He stopped and smiled at her. He winked and released her from the grip he had on her wrist. Vian pouted. He chuckled and placed his hand on the small waist of hers. He smiled warmly and hugged her. She hugged him back, rested her head on his chest, enjoying the comforting warmth of his body.